Okay, hello, good morning. I hope everyone had a good night's sleep. So we'll start with our final keynote speaker. It's my great pleasure to introduce Linda Drijvers. Linda is an assistant professor at the Donders Institute at Radboud University, and she leads the communicative brain group. She did her PhD in Nijmegen in 2019. And great news, very recent, she's just received an ERC starting grant called Handwave. So let's wave hands for that. Okay, so without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you for that lovely introduction. And it feels very festive for me to indeed have that ERC grant. I already knew in July, but now it's officially known, I think, since 2 days. And it's very nice to be among colleagues that I haven't seen in a long time to also discuss these different things. Okay, I'm actually surprised to see so many people here after the conference dinner. And when I was preparing for this talk, I was also thinking I should do something to wake you up a bit in the morning, or at least to immediately grab your attention. So I'm going to start with my take-home message. So it's a bit to set the stage and to wake you up. I'm going to state that the language network in the brain does not exist. And I hope to substantiate that a bit during this talk and to convince you of this, and also to have a good discussion with you about this afterwards. So when I started thinking about how language is organized in the brain, I was thinking this must be a very distributed process. And of course, when you start doing research, you start on a certain topic, you start Googling around, see what's around. And when I was typing in the language network in the brain, and I asked an AI image generator to give me a picture of this, it looked like this. It was all over the brain. So if AI says it, I guess it must be true, right? Kidding aside, when we look at the most prominent models of language in the brain and how language is orchestrated in the brain, some have argued for this fixed language network, so stating that there are certain regions in the brain that are only sensitive to language. They're left lateralized, they don't respond to many other things, so most strongly to language. And I think there has been such an incredible amount of evidence for this. So many fMRI studies that show exactly this pattern. However, when we look at how the neurobiology of language is usually studied, to the evidence that also forms the basis of these models, when you look at the stimuli that they use, they mostly let people listen to single words or simple sentences, and usually it's just auditory, right? And usually it's also in perfectly clear conditions, so you sit in a lab, you have some sound, and it's always clear. Now, what I will argue today is that this results in an incomplete model of language in the brain. And to substantiate this claim, or to start explaining it, I'd first like to look at what we as researchers mean when we describe the so-called language network. And to do so, I've asked NeuroQuery to run through recent publications describing the language network and to make an activation map of all of the regions that are reported to be part of this language network. Now, when you look at this figure, you can actually see that it is quite distributed, right? And this is just on the basis of fMRI studies, so we don't know yet what is happening over time even. So when we look at these figures, it seems to be that most of the brain is actually at work. And perhaps that's not such a wild thought, so that there might be more regions at work than what some may call the language network or the core language network. Now here, for example, you see a natural situation in which people communicate. So you might recognize this from a conference, right? Or from the coffee break. So you're talking to a lot of people. There might be some noise around you. Language comprehension can be quite challenging here. So there are multiple people, multiple input streams. So there's visual information streams, auditory information streams. They're all coming in at the same time. It comes from the face, the body, the hands. Yeah, and on the other hand, language use can also be full of disfluencies, so different topics, incomplete sentences. So language is messy, but most of all, it is multimodal, and especially used in face-to-face communication. So we use it when we actually talk to each other. Today I will argue that all of these information streams, so coming from the speech, the visual speech, so information from the face and from the mouth, also contextual signals, that they are dynamically integrated and that language in the brain emerges from this. Now, let's first look at this situation again in a bit more detail. So this is this natural situation, right, in which we communicate. And the person that you see in the middle is talking to the other person. And you can imagine that this person asks to the other person, did you see those small glasses? Now, this unimodal part, so the speech, would be considered by most models and theories as the fundamental architecture of language. However, there are more things than this auditory speech signal. So we can see people talking, we can see their hand movements as well as their lip movements. And in face-to-face communication, language is therefore really multimodal. So this gesture will help you determine whether or not they're talking about the glasses or the glasses that you can also put on your face. And I was reading through my slides this morning and I thought those small glasses, that's at least not something that holds for the Czech Republic because here the glasses are enormous. So these visual signals have traditionally been considered outside of the linguistic domain and sometimes even have been referred to as non-linguistic. And I will argue that these multimodal aspects of language need to be integrated in our theories of language and that these signals are also taken on board immediately by listeners and that they really shape your interpretation of certain linguistic inputs. Now, in a bit more detail, the main question that we're working on in my group is how do we, as listeners, achieve integrating all of these auditory and visual inputs? So in this face-to-face conversational setting, all of these inputs that you see and that you hear need to be coupled together. And how these auditory and visual signals, how they play together, so how they jointly result in this coherent, integrated message that comes in through all of these different sensory channels, that is still an unresolved problem. And this is the problem, or the main question, that we are working on in my group and that we try to take in new directions, as this is really a foundational problem for our field. Let's step back for a bit, just for one more slide, and this is also a bit inspired by the last keynote yesterday. The bigger question, of course, in these kinds of debates, also of how language is organized in the brain, is what do we consider language to begin with? Now, I doubt that today or anytime soon I will give you a finite answer to this, but what we do know is that all human languages that are used in face-to-face communication involve the visual modality. So no known language only uses speech for its expression. Yet we rarely consider these multimodal signals in our models of the neurobiology of language, and that is odd. I know that I'm talking to a mostly unimodal crowd here, so I thought it would be good to first show you that these multimodal signals influence language processing. So let's go back to this figure again of this person that is gesturing while speaking, and where you can see the lips moving in a natural setting. Now, these visual signals are important to consider because they can convey different kinds of information. So visual speech can say something about the sound or the form of a word, and gestures or meaningful gestures like the shaking example that you see here can say something about the meaning of a word. Now, when we look at older work, these things were mostly studied separately. But of course, these things should be studied in one context. So not just by showing the lips or just the face or just the torso or something like that. All of these things need to be studied together to really figure out how we integrate all of these different signals that are also temporally offset in time. We have done this in a lot of detail. So we've looked at how these visual signals enhance speech comprehension, both in clear speech, but also in noisy speech, because most of the situations in which we communicate are actually quite noisy. So there can be cars in the background. It doesn't have to be loud music every time, but there's always some noise around yeah, that also influences how you process language. And we did this in a paradigm that's actually quite simple. So we showed participants videos, and in these videos they would see a woman who would utter a Dutch action verb. And sometimes her lips would be visible, sometimes not. Sometimes she would make a gesture, and sometimes she would not. And in this way, we could see how much benefit people would have from just the visual speech information or these gestures on top of visual speech. And of course, here we would expect that when speech is a bit more challenging to understand because of noise, that these visual signals would help more. Now, we tried this out in many different conditions, and I won't go over all of them, but I just want to give you the main message. So I'm just going to jump straight to the results. And what we can see is that iconic gestures, or gestures that carry meaning, can actually enhance speech when it is noisy. So let me walk you through this graph a bit. Can you see my cursor? Yeah. So here you have how much enhancement you get from different inputs. Here we had different conditions. 2-band and 6-band noise vocoding would be like severe noise or moderate noise. The orange bar shows what kind of enhancement you get from having all of these visual inputs present. The blue one is just a gesture, and the gray one is just visual speech. And as you can see, especially when speech is moderately degraded, you can see that these visual signals help more. And that's, of course, when you don't have enough sound to recognize, then even a meaningful gesture might not help you to understand it. So these visual signals influence language processing. Now, we tested this in many different variants because, of course, there can be quite some individual differences here as well. So does everyone benefit? Older adults also benefit from these iconic gestures during speech and noise comprehension, but this benefit is modulated by verbal working memory. And if you want to know anything more about these studies that I'm going to mention, then I would happily discuss that in the questions. We've seen this for native listeners in more sentence-like context. So we started out doing this with just words, but built that up to more natural context to see if these things would still hold, and also using different kinds of noise. Autistic individuals also benefit as much as non-autistic individuals, which was quite surprising because often they say that audiovisual integration in autism might be altered and they might find visual signals during natural communication quite difficult, but that didn't seem to be the case. We've seen this for non-native listeners. We see that they look more at gestures, but that they actually benefit less, which was also quite surprising to me because you would think that when you're on holiday, right, you use your gestures to make yourself more clear. You seem to look at those, but it's difficult to get the semantic information out of it and couple it to the things that you hear. And even where you grow up makes a difference. So if you grow up in a busy city as opposed to a very quiet environment, you benefit less than when you grow up in a quiet environment. Okay, that was a brief introduction for how multimodal signals can actually influence language processing. But of course, this talk is about the brain, so let's move to that. So how do these auditory and visual signals then interact in the brain? Now, when I started out with this, there was mostly knowledge from fMRI. So people would watch videos and would then researchers would see where these integration effects of coupling gestures or visual speech to speech would occur. Now, if you think about these natural settings and you think about it in a very simple way, you could say that regions with vision, that have something to do with vision, would have something to do with this, because you see it. Regions that have something to do with movement, and also what some people might call the language network. So something on the left lateralized side of the brain that processes speech, meaning, and also couples all of these different things together. Now, of course, language unfolds over time. So what we wanted to do was to see how these different regions get engaged while people are putting together these different input streams. And for that, we turned to MEG. So we would have a good temporal resolution and a reasonable spatial resolution using structural MRI as well. And I'm not going to go into the details of all of the things that we looked at there, but I want to focus on one thing. So we looked at neural oscillations, and neural oscillations can be described as rhythmic fluctuations of cortical excitability, and they could be important for putting all of this information together. Now we looked at one specific type of oscillatory rhythms, which is alpha. Now what do we know about alpha oscillations? Alpha is a sort of, let's just say, a default state of the brain, and when an area in the brain needs to be recruited for a particular task, then you can see that alpha power needs to be suppressed. And this is a sign or signal of the fact that these areas are now actively involved in a certain task. Now, of course, areas that are not actively involved should then not change in alpha power, right? So you could say that alpha then sort of acts as a sort of gating mechanism. So you can see which regions are recruited over time and which regions are not or are being inhibited to make sure that this information flow is optimal. So if we look at our example, we would see and we would think these regions are relevant for putting these different input streams together. We would only expect to suppress alpha power over these colored regions. So we used our videos again, the ones that I briefly mentioned earlier, and we presented participants with videos with a gesture versus no gesture, and clear speech versus moderately noise-vocoded speech. Now remember, this was this level where these gestures add most to comprehension, right? So you would expect that if a gesture aids comprehension, and any effect of these alpha oscillations that I talked about before would also be strongest in conditions where there is noise and a gesture is present. Now, the task for participants was really easy. So they looked at some videos and they had to identify which verb in this case they heard. And I must say we also did this in sentence context later on. Now, if you're not familiar with looking at oscillatory activity, then I can imagine that this can be quite difficult to process on a Saturday morning around 9:15. So I tried to make this as visual as possible. So here you can see a film strip of a certain gesture, and I'm going to show you what that would look like. So if the gesture and the speech in a certain video would be to zip, it would be something like this, to zip. And what I'm going to show to you is how the brain responds to this over time. So you can see what happens when, for example, the speech starts. So you can see a timeline above, when a gesture starts, etc. Now, what we see here is what happens with alpha power. And the blue means that alpha power is being suppressed, so that regions are being recruited for a particular function, in this case, a speech-gesture integration. Now, the shaded bar that I made there from around 700 milliseconds onwards shows that at that point, the effects became significant as well. And you can see that while you are processing speech and gestures, that this activity goes over the brain. It starts at right temporal regions, it goes to more visual regions, left lateralized regions, etc. Now, we believe that when you are in a noisy naturalistic setting, you sort of recruit these visual areas to also give more visual attention to these gestures. Now then, we saw some activity exactly in the hand area of the motor cortex, showing that you simulate this information from the gesture to also make it easier to understand the speech. And finally, we see these left lateralized effects again, also over regions that are known to be involved in putting all of these things together. So you couple the information then. Just a fun fact, this also shows very strong links to behavior. So the more you show this alpha power suppression, the more you also show a benefit of recognition on a behavioral task. Now, I've seen some posters about non-native processing, so I thought I'll add 2 slides to see how this works in non-native processing as well. So I come from Nijmegen, which is a small city near the German border. So we have a lot of German students there, so it was ideal to see what would happen if they would learn Dutch, and what then would happen with gesture processing in the brain as well. They show actually a very similar network, but there are some differences. So for the native listeners, we can actually see that they recruit these regions that have something to do with visual speech information processing more strongly. They find it easier to put this information together and also probably to recruit or to retrieve, I would say, the meaning of such a gesture. But again, the larger the suppression, the larger the benefit was, and this was also the case for non-native listeners. Now, when I started out, I said that I'm interested in how auditory and visual information interacts in the brain. But so far, I've basically just shown you some MEG results that also just show which regions are being recruited over time, right? So I haven't answered that question yet. So to actually answer this, we developed a novel technique called rapid invisible frequency tagging. Rapid invisible frequency tagging uses novel projector technology to display or flicker certain inputs on the screen at a very high speed. And you can do this by modulating the luminance of certain parts of the screen. And it goes so fast that you cannot see it with your eyes. So to make that a bit more concrete, here's our video again. And now imagine that I would flicker the middle part of the screen. And here I've done it at a very low frequency so that you can actually see it. But if I do this above 60 Hertz, you will not see anything of this. Let's say I do this at 68 Hertz, so a luminance modulation at 68 Hertz. Now, what we then see in the brain is a 68 Hertz signal over these visual regions. So we can actually follow what happens with the information that we tag on the screen. Now, we can also do that with speech. So here for this example, let's say I've used 61 Hertz. And you can already guess it, you will see a 61 Hertz brain signal over auditory regions in the brain. Now, so far that's not so surprising, but what we found is that when these two different signals interact, you see an intermodulation frequency, so a combination of these two different inputs, and that happens at the sum and the difference of these two frequencies. For the aficionados, that's just because when you multiply two different sine waves, you will see something at the sum and the difference there. So this gives us a very concrete marker of when in time and where in the brain certain information is being coupled. So we can actually see how information, to say it very simply, travels through the brain as well. Using this technique has some advantages as well. So it leaves these lower frequency oscillations, like the alpha oscillations that I was talking about, unperturbed. So we can actually see how these frequency tagged signals and the frequency tagged signal in the brain also connects to these different oscillations of interest. And it's invisible. So that makes it way more naturalistic to do for participants in the lab as well. And it gives us a sort of wiretap for perceptual processing. Now, in principle, this all sounds great and simple, of course, and everything should work out just fine while using this. Well, when we started out doing this, it was a bit of a different story. So, of course, we needed to provide a proof of principle of this technique first. So we went back to our stimuli that I mentioned before. So again, these videos of people gesturing. We again used the MEG that allowed us to replicate our previous results, but also to use this technique. And we again let them answer what kind of verb was being portrayed in these videos. Now, of course, when you're trying to figure out such a technique, you first have to see whether or not it actually does what you want it to do, right? So how we approached this was by looking at what would happen if we would compare an artificial 68 Hertz sine wave that would represent the flickering that we would do on the screen and the actual response of this 68 Hertz wave in the brain. And when you look at that, you see that it actually seems to work. So we see some visual activity there. Some interesting finding is that we can already see that this seems to spread to these more left lateralized regions that we have seen before. And when we compare what happens in clear versus degraded speech, we see that this is actually also modulated by conditions. So people look more at a gesture when speech is clear. And that might sound a bit counterintuitive, because if it's noisy, then of course you would want to process this information from the gesture more, right? But you look at the face, actually. So, yeah. Now, when we look at the sounds, we can see a strong right lateralized source. We also saw this on the left side, but I'm just plotting the top 20% of the values here, and it's mostly driven by the degraded speech signal. So again, we would interpret this as when a speech signal is degraded, you allocate more attention to it. Now, these were a sanity check, so not super interested in at that point. What we were interested in is what would happen with this intermodulation frequency. So what would happen when we couple these different input streams together? So again, we took this similar approach. We had this 7 hertz. We chose 7, not 129, because it's too high to measure. We had the 7 hertz wave, and we tried to see how similar it was to a 7 hertz signal in the brain that would correspond to this integration. And this is what we got. Absolutely nothing. So at that point, I was sort of fearing for my sanity. But we also looked at a different part of the signal that is not so dependent on time, so power, and then we indeed saw the same regions pop up again that we saw in MEG work. This seems to be strongest when you can actually couple the information together. So it seems to be that it's some sort of marker for lower order interactions of auditory and visual inputs. So again, more strong for clear speech. Now, as a next step, we wanted to see whether frequency tagging could be used to study attention allocation during multimodal language processing. And this is work by a former postdoc in the group, Noor Seidel, who again used these videos. So these videos, they have been used in many different experiments at this point. And she tagged the information of a gesture at 2 different frequencies on the screen and asked participants to attend to one of the 2 videos. And what we saw was that when you attend to a certain video, that the power at such tagged frequencies would also be stronger. So next to using it as some sort of wiretap for perceptual processing, we can also use it as a marker for attention. And again, we saw a similar intermodulation frequency pop up. Now, some ongoing work, so something new. So is the strength of this intermodulation frequency then dependent also on the informativeness of visual signals? So does it matter if your hand gesture is more informative or your lip movements are more informative? So sometimes it's more easy to recognize one of the 2. This is something that we tested by looking at different levels of informativeness of gestures and visual speech. And this was sort of putting these results that I've just presented together. And just very quickly, because it's very preliminary, we can indeed see that people seem to attend to the gesture more when speech is clear, what we've seen before, to the lip movements more when speech is degraded, same for the sound, and that these intermodulation frequencies exist as well. Now, the next step is to also link this to these different levels of informativeness that we've coded for all of the visual inputs. Okay, so as an interim summary, I hope that I showed you that multimodal signals indeed influence language processing, that brain oscillations, or these brain waves that I was talking about, support the engagement of these task-relevant brain areas while you are integrating auditory and visual information. And I've hoped to make some people enthusiastic about RIFT as well. So RIFT seems to be a promising method to study this neural interaction of different input streams, but also the propagation of auditory and visual information. Okay, so at this point you might think, she has been talking about studying these naturalistic settings and making sure that you look at a real communication in these more crowded contexts, and still she's putting people behind the computer, letting them listen to single words and just watching a screen. And you're absolutely right. So the next step that we took was a real communicative setting. So what happens when people are actually talking to each other? What kind of effects do we see then? And do we still see that synchronization of, for example, brain oscillations is relevant in these kinds of processes? Now, the first question that we should then ask is, why would synchronization matter? So let's go back to the case of within a brain first. So previous work has suggested that the synchronization of this oscillatory activity may be necessary for the selection, the gating, and the integration, so the things that we just discussed, across cortical areas within one brain. And in the case of multimodal language, this is relevant because these different sensory signals from one modality may change the cortical excitability of signals in another modality. We briefly looked at this as well. So how do these low frequency oscillations then support multimodal integration? So to really see how information is being propagated. And then you might think that long-range alpha band phase synchrony, so synchrony between regions that are relevant for putting these different signals together, should be stronger in cases where it's easier to couple these different inputs. And we've seen for quite some participants that this is indeed the case. I'm just looking at the time, and I'm going to quickly skip to between brains. How does that then work between brains when you actually have a speaker and a listener present? This is work that has been done by Sarah Mazzini, who just finished her PhD, so she just finished all of this as well. And she thought that alignment between people, or just neural alignment as well, might occur because of oscillatory synchronization between brains. And this is a claim that has been put forward in quite some work. So there has been, there have been a lot of studies that showed that inter-brain synchrony somehow connects to communication. And we were a bit skeptical about this at first, because it's not magic, right? So it cannot be that there is some magic telepathy between brains that makes sure that you are all exactly on the same wavelength, sort of saying. So she asked in her PhD, is neural synchrony, so the things that I've talked about before as well, is it necessary or is it beneficial for successful face-to-face communication? So does it actually affect how we communicate with each other? So if we are not in sync, then, is it more difficult to communicate? And when we are in sync, is it then easier? The first question you ask then is, which mechanisms make communication successful? So you try to link behavior to mutual understanding, and the literature said that this synchrony must be very important for this. And of course, synchrony can be achieved in many different ways. Visual information could also be a part of this. So if you have some visual information that makes it easier to understand speech, that might actually help. But of course, we need to look at moments where communication is then also not successful. And for that, she actually looked at other-initiated repair. Now, for the people not familiar with other-initiated repair, this is the ongoing course of the conversation. When the ongoing course of the conversation is interrupted to attend to possible trouble in speaking, hearing, or understanding. And we took that as a signal of miscommunication. So I have some examples of this. I'm just going to put them all on the screen and read you one. So imagine that someone says, got football later. Someone else responds, yeah, and then looks down at a watch. Are you playing? At the same time, this person says, better go soon, actually. And then someone says, huh? So asking for clarification. Are you playing footy? Repairing it? Yeah, I think so. Accepting it. So here you can see that there is a moment where communication is not going smoothly, right? And these things happen quite often in natural communication. So these were the things that we were going to focus on in her work as well. And to do so, we let people participate in a tangram task. This consisted of giving participants 2 different grids with all sorts of different figures. And they had to ensure that they ended up with the same order of figures on their grid. And we didn't give them much instruction. So we didn't say, you are the person that takes charge and you are the one that tries to match them. We just said, naturally communicate with each other about it. Make sure you end up with the same grid at the end of 30 minutes. Now, when we look at these other-initiated repairs and how they could then link to oscillatory activity, we thought it would actually be quite simple. So there could be a trouble source, like talking about what I think is a duck, saying this one has no feet, and then someone would say, does it have hanging feet? Nay, no feet. Okay. So resolving it and accepting it later on as well. Now we expected that when there would be a trouble source, the synchrony would be less. And when you resolve it, synchrony would go up. Pretty simple. And I'm going to let you show an example of how messy this data is. And bear with me because I'm going to play the sound via this microphone, but it will have subtitles as well.
Op de een heb je, ja, ik weet niet hoe ik het moet omschrijven, een soort insect. Op de een heb je, ja, ik weet niet hoe ik het moet omschrijven, een soort insect. Dus 2 driehoeken naast elkaar. Daaronder een lichaam en dan onder het lichaam een driehoek. Een soort insect. Ja, ik denk dat je deze bedoelt. Ja, dus hij heeft hij wijst naar links. Met zijn kop, of ja, hij heeft een soort van, ja, ik weet niet of het zijn kop is. Ik denk dat ik die op C1 heb dan misschien. Oké, ik heb op C1 heb ik een vogel die wel met zijn kop naar boven de vleugels uitkomt. Ja, dat heb ik ook en die kijkt dan naar links. Oké, dan zit die goed. Een soort insect met 2 driehoeken. Een soort van slang onder zijn lichaam. Ik weet niet of het een slang is, maar hij heeft zeg maar er zijn 2 driehoeken naast elkaar. Zeg maar op dezelfde hoogte. En daaronder zit dan het lichaam. Oké, ik heb wel, en dan daarboven een soort van hoofd. En dan daaronder een driehoekje nog. Een soort van totempaal vind ik dat meer. Nee, want hij is zeg maar echt meer horizontaal. Het ziet er een beetje uit. Oké, het kan ook een vogel zijn die met een prooi vliegt, maar dat weet ik niet zo goed. Oké, ik zie echt even wat je bedoelt. Ah, ja, maar die heb ik op B3 heb ik die. Op B3 heb ik. Oh, maar dat is meer, dat heb ik als totempaal. Daar heb ik de totempaal. Oké, ik heb nou de totempaal heb ik op B3. En die van nu doe ik dan op D1. Ja.
Yeah, so as you can see, oh no, we have the same thing happening as yesterday. Oh no, okay, it's stable. As you could see, there are many of misunderstandings during these kind of tasks, and people are moving around quite freely, and they're also making gestures all of the time. So this gives us a very rich data set to look at, and lots to annotate as well. So Sarah spent 4 years just making sure that all of these signals are also properly coded, which is very impressive. Now, at that point, we were super excited. We thought we have so much data points. We know that there are many misunderstandings. If this whole synchrony thing between brains is true, and if it is relevant and necessary for communication, these effects should be super strong. Now, we looked at the literature, and most people look at alpha oscillations and beta oscillations, and there has been quite some work published that shows that it's modulated by communication. But we found nothing. So we looked at alpha and beta in clear speech. We also tried noisy speech. We didn't find any differences between repair initiations and solutions, so moments of misunderstanding versus understanding. Also not with Bayesian methods. So at that point, we really thought, maybe it's relevant for having some form of shared attention to a certain process. So we did see differences between a baseline and when they were communicating successfully, but not versus non-successfully, but nothing beyond that. Now you can imagine that it's quite tough for a PhD student to find out after 4 years that it does not work out. But this is a very rich data set, so there were other things she could look at as well. And one of the interesting things that she found was that the gestures of an interlocutor actually improve neural tracking of speech for the listener. So you attend to the speech signal more strongly when you see meaningful gestures being present. And we compared this to just normal movements like, I don't know, fixing your shirt or going through your hair in a non-communicative way, etc. Now, is then all lost for interbrain synchrony? Does it not respond to anything in conversation? That's also not the case. So in some previous work I did together with Judith Holler, we wanted to see whether visual signals, as opposed to, for example, sitting face-to-face to each other, also affected neural synchrony. And there we actually did see effects. So when you are sitting towards each other, you see that synchrony is more strong. Then when you're sitting back to back or with a screen in between you, But what was interesting is that it's not just these visual signals that seem to affect interbrain synchrony there. So even just having the feeling of sitting face to face to someone makes you synchronize to a person more strongly. Okay, I'm going back to the start because I said the language network in the brain does not exist. So taking all of this information into account. So I've shown to you that these multimodal signals affect language processing, that it involves this broadly distributed network. What does this then mean for our models of language in the brain? Now, I would like to propose that language is an emergent property of dynamic integration and that it's not reducible to these individual brain areas. So that means that it's not a static set of rules or an isolated cognitive function, but a dynamic system that evolves and also adapts in response to multisensory information, contextual cues, and also prior knowledge. So, in my opinion, to partition something in the brain as a language network, so to say, is also overlooking this fluidity, this context dependency, and also the inherent dynamic character of language. So, in very simple words, I would say this is similar to trying to understand the ocean by looking at single drops of water. So perhaps we should no longer ask what the language network is, but we should search for these universal processing capacities that are in the brain and that allow for these different neural subroutines or computations to be puzzled together. So for example, in situation X, we might have multiple task-relevant neural networks that need to communicate with each other to put together these different relevant bits that make up language in daily life. And here it's important that this is not static, so it adapts to the different demands that we have during language processing. And different regions can then also take up different roles depending on the context and the specific requirements of a certain environment. Now, such a framework, when I started out, I called this dynamic integration and emergence, but later I found out that if you abbreviate this, it's DI, and it's a bit aggressive. That it better accounts for this flexibility and adaptability of language processing. So if we follow this framework that I briefly sketched in the previous slides, when you acknowledge this dynamic nature of the language network, it's also sort of necessitates this reevaluation of its interaction with other brain regions. So I would like to propose that the language network is not acting as a discrete unit that communicates in a linear fashion, but it forms part of this dynamic interconnected network that facilitates the integration of these different kinds of information. And this means that the interactions between these nodes and also other brain regions are then characterized by flexibility and also plasticity, enabling the brain to adapt to these different linguistic contexts. So does that then indeed mean that the language network does not exist? So how does this very simple framework that does not have a lot of data yet, how does that then explain all of this mountain of evidence that we have seen by other labs using fMRI? I would like to propose that an alternative explanation might be that this network that has been seen in these previous studies, that this emerges because you are isolating specific linguistic processing from its natural context. So any core language network would then be a case of adaptive specialization. So certain regions may have developed a high degree of efficiency for processing language because they are frequently involved in this process, but this does not preclude their involvement in other processes, and it's also not an intrinsic property that limits them to just language by itself. Alternatively, this language network could simply be conceived as a collection of hierarchically organized auditory association cortices, communicating with functional connectivity hubs that coordinates this whole brain distribution of contextually determined and therefore also variable peripheral regions. Always when I present this, people say, yeah, okay, but all the data is out there and it shows a super similar pattern. We've actually tried to simulate the data that has been found before based on the regions that are shown there. Yeah, and what we see is that when you take out this temporal dimension, that you indeed end up with the language network as we know it from the literature. But if we analyze it in a certain way where we can look at what happens at different time points, we can actually see that it's very variable and that the whole brain seems to be involved into this. At the same time, and that's also something that plays into this, is that yeah, you're averaging in many different ways. So you're also averaging over syntactic structures, semantic structures, etc. So yeah, all of these things together calls for more naturalistic data that takes this temporal character into account as well. So where do we need to go from here then? I think we should start studying language in these more ecologically valid settings. So when we look at brain research, language as construed for brain research is not the same as language use and comprehension in daily life. But of course, we don't want to throw away all of the super important results that we have seen over the last decade. So we need to go from observing to active participation. So is this laboratory then a valid model for real-world communication? And natural data at the same time can also be used to inform hypotheses that are tested in the lab. So we can keep having this loop between the lab and naturalistic data to see if these different things can inform each other and also get us further. So what are then the outstanding questions? Well, as I said, there are many different signals that need to be put together. They all start at different moments in time. They have different temporal profiles, and the brain needs to somehow know what needs to be coupled and what does not need to be coupled. So how are these different signals then integrated and combined? That's something that we will be working on in the next few years. How does behavior relate to neural synchrony and back? Individual differences, so can differences in neural patterns also explain behavior? And how is natural language organized in the brain? Now, Radim, you already mentioned that I just got an ERC, so I thought I'll do some advertising. So if you know any students, or if you are a student that might be interested in working on this, we will be starting a project also together with Cecilia, who can wave for a bit, because you can also talk to her in the coffee break. That starts in somewhere the first part of the next year. So if you're interested in this, talk to me or talk to Cecilia to figure out more. For now, these are the people that have been involved in the work over the last few years. And thank you so much for your very early attention after the conference dinner.
Thanks a lot, Linda, for that great keynote. And so now we're ready for questions for our... Yes, in the back. You'll get a mic, you'll get a mic.
So thanks, it was a very interesting talk. I wanted to ask you sort of a high-level question based on your drawing a line through the language network.
Can you talk a bit louder? I'm sorry, I cannot fully hear you.
Okay. I wanted to ask you a higher level question about your drawing a line through the language network. Let me preface my remarks by saying I don't have a dog in this fight, so it doesn't matter to me, and I don't think any of the people who care about this are here, so we're among friends. So I'm interested in seeing if you want to be a little less diplomatic about crossing out the language network, insofar as I don't think that some of the people who invoke the language network would necessarily disagree with your selective adaptation hypothesis. So I'm just wondering, to what extent are you trying to strike through the language network? So how far are you going with that? And if you feel comfortable with it, how does that relate to the models that exist out there, which are often competing with each other quite vociferously in print? Do you understand the question?
It's a very fair point. So of course, I don't want to say that there is no language network in the brain to begin with. But what I'm saying is that there's not a fixed language network. So what differs with these other models as well is that they say that these regions are only involved in language and nothing else. So they are most responsive to just language inputs, no other cognitive function. I don't think that is the case. So these different regions can also respond to other inputs. And the way it has been tested in the past has also made sure that, yeah, that you are only focusing on those regions while you are testing language. So I would say there's a little bit of circularity involved in there as well. As I said, of course, there are some regions that seem to have a high processing efficiency for certain linguistic inputs, and they could definitely overlap with these regions that people call the language network. But it's broader than that. So you recruit from different areas as well, and you integrate that as well. And these regions that are defined as the language network in previous models are not just selective to language. I hope that answers it.
Thanks for the clarification.
Okay, we have a lady there. Yep. You're getting mic. Yep, there you go.
Hi, thanks. That was wonderful. Just wondering if you wanted to comment on how your model would apply to populations that might have more unimodal language networks, such as sign languages for the deaf.
Yeah, I think a similar thing could apply actually to signed languages. By having such a fluid network, so to say, it gives room to the recruitment of different regions that are relevant for processing sign language as well. So I think it could very well fit with that. We won't be looking at that in the years to come, but I think it would be an exciting avenue to go into. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Oh yeah, Eva Wittenberg there. Yep.
Hello, thanks so much. This was such a great talk. I have an uninformed question about the intermodulation paradigm, which I think my postdoc Anna Kamenetsky would be much better suited to ask, but I'm just going to ask it anyway. So, from the little I know, the intermodulation paradigms are responsive to more perceptual, very rapid processing. Is that correct?
Well, we have usually you just use it to look at the interaction of two different inputs, but you also see it on more lower levels as well. So if you would have a beep and a flash, so this has mostly been done with more low frequency tagging, so where it is visible, you indeed also see these intermodulation frequencies pop up. I think there's also some work that looked at just images on the screen as well. Again, lower frequency tagging, but there we also see these intermodulation frequencies. So when you couple two different input streams, this signal pops up. And I guess the newer thing here is that now it's no longer perceptually visible, at least.
Right. So my question is a little bit, what do you think the intermodulation tells you about which level of representations are interacting? So are you detecting the coupling of the perceptual signal, or are you detecting the coupling of I have understood the meaning of this gesture and I have understood the meaning of this word, and now I bring them together?
Let me quickly get the results back up as well to show the answer to this. So to my surprise, we actually only saw it for the coupling of more lower level.
That would have been, that's how I understood it. And I think that fits very well with the previous literature from Vision, right?
Yes, and I must say that at this, I expected this mismatch manipulation that we had here, so the semantic manipulation, to actually have an effect as well. We didn't find it here. But Cecilia has done some unimodal work where there was a semantic manipulation as well, and there you could actually see an effect. So I think the jury is still out. I still hope to find it in upcoming paradigms. But yeah, at this point, I think the safer bet is to say that it responds to the interaction of more lower level.
Okay, so if you had a lower frequency, would you expect higher level representations to be interacting?
You mean a lower frequency of stimulating? I don't think the speed of frequency tagging will affect the intermodulation frequency, but I do think that the danger exists that when you do this at lower frequencies, it will also potentially perturb the oscillatory activity that you're interested in. So I guess that sort of underlines why we need this higher frequency tagging to begin with, to actually figure these things out in more detail.
Thanks.
Okay, we still have time for questions. Okay, Dushita, please. Maybe from behind.
Thank you for the beautiful talk, Dušita Filipović from University of Belgrade. I'm referring to your intuition, basically, because I'm very curious about it. So what is your intuition on what type of analytic tools would enable us to fully understand the nature of integration? So for example, my intuition is that we need to talk to physicists and nonlinear dynamical systems scientists, those who study fluids and stuff like that, because at this level, I think our typical analytical tools are not going to help. And I was wondering what's your intuition on it?
Well, I've actually thought about exactly the same as well, that we need to draw from different fields to figure out how this integration actually works. And what we're going to do in the next few years is to look at integrated information decomposition. So to have a look at what information, when you couple these different things together, is unique, what is redundant, and what is actually synergistic. So what cannot be explained by the two different inputs. And this will allow us to also really see how meaning or the integration of the two inputs, how that emerges in the brain, and also how this links to, for example, this more fluid language network in the brain. But I do think that drawing on these kinds of techniques, these more non-linear techniques and information theoretic analysis methods is the next step in this field. So yeah, completely agree.
I think we have time for one last question. Okay, if there aren't any, then let's thank Linda again for that wonderful keynote.